Welcome to Beneath the Bible, where we're helping you dig deeper and uncover the world beneath the sacred book. Today we turn our attention to Jezebel, the infamous Tyrian queen of Israel and the wife of Ahab. Jezebel is roundly condemned in the Bible for spreading the worship of her gods throughout the northern kingdom of Israel and influencing Ahab to build cultic sites in their honor. She went even further, seeking to root out the worship of Yahweh and eliminate Yahweh's prophets like Elijah and Elisha, though of course she was ultimately unsuccessful. The Bible paints a clear picture of Jezebel as practicing every kind of evil that offended the God of Israel. Yet despite that reputation, Jezebel has had something of a renaissance in recent times as something of a feminist icon and a symbol of women's empowerment. She exercised the power and privileges of her office to the fullest extent and showed that ancient queens didn't just have to sit in the palace at the behest of their king. Is it possible for us today to be sympathetic to Jezebel, or even to find some admirable qualities in her? Well, probably not quite. But she is a more complex figure than you might realize. Let's dig into what we can know about Jezebel, her history, and her role as Israel's most infamous queen. First of all, it's important to note that the only definitive accounts we have of Jezebel appear in the Bible. We don't have any ancient records or artifacts that can definitively be tied to her existence. She's only mentioned 21 times in the Bible, but she makes quite the impact in just a few short references. So, to understand this infamous woman, let's look at some background of where she comes from and the world that she helped to shape. Our sources for Jezebel and her background are admittedly limited. Her name in Hebrew is spelled like this. Most scholars believe her name means something like Zebel exists, with Zebel being a euphemism for Baal. The idea is that her actual name was probably rendered Jezebel, meaning where is the prince? Now this may be a line from the Baal cycle, which would make her name part of a class of interrogative sentence names. We see this elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible with names like Eliezer, which means where is God's help? So Jezebel's name would invoke Baal, but it could also align with her with the consort of Baal, who is addressed with the question of where is Baal in the Baal cycle. Alternatively, it could have been an expression used during rituals associated with the apparent disappearance of Baal during the dry seasons. Some have even gone as far as to suggest that this may point to Jezebel having a summertime birthday. Her background and family lineage are likewise difficult to pin down. We know she was from the royal family of Phoenicia, but much of our reconstruction of Phoenician political history comes from sparse references from the biblical text and Neo-Assyrian references. Now, this really just gives us snapshots of Phoenician history, but we also have classical sources like Josephus who give us an outline of a political history. These later sources are generally taken to be accurate, but to be honest, we don't have much of a choice. Either we take these later sources as mostly accurate, or we admit that we can't really reconstruct any of the history of the Phoenician city-states. From the sources we have, we see that Jezebel is the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians. Now this is confusing because Ethbaal, or usually called Itobaal, was first king of Tyre. From what we can tell about Itobaal, he was apparently a priest of Ashtart who fomented a coup against the ruling king of Tyre. He became king, presumably retaining his position as priest as well, and ushered in a prolonged period of prosperity from about 888 BC through about 856. His reign stabilized the politics of Tyre for a while, and under him, Tyrian commerce and colonization around the Mediterranean prospered, including the development of a colony in North Africa. He also expanded Tyrian influence and control within Phoenicia, which included the refoundation of Batroun or Batruna near Byblos. He was also apparently made king of the city of Sidon, unifying the two most important Phoenician city-states of the 9th century under one king. However, these two city-states were always distinct entities, kind of the way Judah and Israel were quite likely distinct even while they were ruled by one person. He was succeeded by his son and Jezebel's brother, Baal-azar, who was then succeeded by his own son, Matan, who was succeeded by his son Pygmalion, whose queen Dido fled Tyre and founded a little town in North Africa called Carthage. So, Jezebel was the daughter of a usurper king who, though possibly illegitimate, was competent and expanded the influence and power of the city of Tyre. Like many princesses throughout history, she was married off to a foreign prince for political reasons. And that brings us to where we find Jezebel in the Bible.
Diplomatic marriages have a very long history in the ancient Near East, with documented cases going back to the late 3rd millennium. As with all very long traditions, the practice of diplomatic marriages evolved and shifted over the millennia. For example, in the 14th century, the pharaohs of Egypt would marry foreign princesses, but they would never marry off their own princesses. The Egyptians felt that the foreign kingdoms were tacitly recognizing the supremacy of Egypt, while the foreign kingdoms felt they gained status by becoming the father-in-laws of the pharaoh. So when we see Itobal marry his daughter to Ahab, the son of Omri, we have to be careful in how we interpret this. Is this marriage alliance between equals, or is one party perceived to be advantaged over the other? Well, it's impossible to say with the information we have, but the nature of the relationship is important. It is notable that both Omri and Itobal were usurpers. Tyre had a tradition of dynastic rule going all the way back to Hiram of Tyre, who dealt with King Solomon, but the northern kingdom of Israel didn't really have the same dynastic tradition. Only with Ahab's ascent to the throne do we see a more firm dynastic impulse instead of the sort of tribal elective monarchical system. Ahab's marriage to Jezebel may be seen as a way for both sides to shore up international support for each king's status as king, in addition to securing benefits like closer economic and cultural ties. Jezebel played an important geopolitical role in the 9th century. And it seems that this union did bring a measure of prosperity for the two kingdoms. Sites like Samaria and Jezreel show monumental architecture and urban planning during the reign of the Omrides. Fortified sites in Moab like Jahaz show territorial expansion and testify to the militaristic capabilities of the Omrides. There are enough Omride sites that archaeologists can identify characteristic Omride architecture, which include constructed podiums, moats, pier and chamber gates, and a casement-enclosed compound. While they date to a later period, the Samaria ostraca show an economically prosperous area around the royal estate with an organized bureaucratic apparatus to manage it, which likely attests to the successes of the Omrides in establishing Samaria as the capital of the northern kingdom. So in some archaeological excavations show the Omrides oversaw a large kingdom that was well organized and exerted a sphere of influence beyond traditional Israelite territory. How much of this is related to the alliance with Tyre versus how much is due to other factors is not entirely clear, but an ascendant Tyre would have matched well with Omride Israel as the two polities were burgeoning regional powers. So what might it have been like for Jezebel to rule in Israel? Well, what we can say is that, as we see in many other cases of diplomatic marriages, the foreign princess likely had a sizable dowry and would have maintained a measure of independence that most other women did not enjoy. It's possible that she even made contact with Tyre, though this certainly was not always the case with diplomatic marriages. In some diplomatic correspondences of the Bronze Age, some kings essentially say, we won't send another princess because we haven't heard from the other one we sent and we don't even know if she's alive. Whereas the wife of Zimri-Lin of Mari, also from the Bronze Age, keep close tabs on her husband's actions and then sends reports back to her father. Where on that spectrum Jezebel fell is just really not clear. The discovery of a seal, which some scholars identify as the seal of Jezebel, would point to her having a significant degree of autonomy, especially given the details of the seal. We have a whole video coming soon on that artifact where we will discuss whether it actually was Jezebel's seal or not, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss that. We do see in Kings a curious phrase of 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah that eat at Jezebel's table. This doesn't literally mean that they ate at her table, just that she maintained her own finances, that she used at her discretion, and that she was the patroness of those prophets. But while she maintained her own finances, it was still expected that her husband would provide for her. And this is the context in which we should understand verses in 1 Kings 16. Samaria was essentially the private estate of the Omrides and was also the capital of the kingdom, but it was the capital because it was the primary estate of the Omride kings. So Ahab provides means for his wife to worship her gods. It's notable that the phrase Ahab went to worship Baal may hint at Ahab going to Tyre and worshiping their god there. And this is distinct from him building a temple and altar to Baal in addition to an Asherah pole in Samaria, which is more like him providing for his foreign wife's cultic practices. We see this with the story of Solomon, for example, where Solomon built altars to foreign gods that his foreign wives worshipped. But Ahab draws particular ire from the biblical authors for his ambivalence, or worse, acceptance of these foreign gods.
Now, which gods were these? The Bible says Baal and Asherah, and we have videos on both of these deities. But we do note that the particular iterations of these deities may be distinct in these cases, particularly for Baal. In this verse, it's clear that Ahab had built an Asherah pole, which is a cultic implement and not necessarily indicative of which goddess it was used to worship. Jezebel's father was a priest of Astarte in Tyre, so it's entirely plausible that Astarte worship was practiced in Samaria. While in the Bible, Baal is the only name used to refer to the Canaanite storm god, elsewhere this god is called Hadad or Baal Hadad. It's possible, maybe even probable, that Hadad is not the deity that Jezebel introduced to the court of Israel. In later sources, it's clear that Tyrian Baal was also known as Melkart. Melkart was associated with a Mesopotamian underworld deity, Nergal, and with Heracles in the west. In some Aramean sources, Melkart is a warrior deity. In other sources, he's associated with rebirth, a sort of dying and rising figure who needed to be awakened. But we don't have any specific myths associated with the Tyrian Baal. However, some have suggested Jezebel's Baal was not Melkart, but Baal Shemem, or the Lord of Heaven, who in later periods became a popular deity throughout the Phoenician coast. In the early first millennium, including the 9th century, the term Baal Shemem is more a title for the chief god in the pantheon, which was often a storm god like Hadad. This changes in later periods, but that's a topic for another time. But all this to say, it's not clear who specifically this Baal is that Jezebel brings with her from Tyre. It may be the storm god, it may be Melkart. Elijah's contest on Mount Carmel, which is our best place to figure out this god's identity, actually has evidence for both options. For example, the fire from heaven is reminiscent of the storm god Baal Hadad. It's what you'd expect from a storm god, to send lightning from the heavens. But Elijah's mocking of Baal needing to be awakened sounds a lot like what we know of the Melkart ritual, where he needs to be awakened with a fire ritual. Now, whoever this deity was, it's important to note that the Omrides were singled out as particularly evil because they introduced this foreign cult into Israel. Other kings are judged against Jeroboam, who built Yahwistic shrines with calf images at Bethel and Dan. But Ahab is judged most harshly not because he married a foreign princess, but because he introduced the foreign cult into Israel. Jeroboam may have been bad, but Ahab's evil is described as more than all that went before him. Not only did he permit worship of false gods, but his queen Jezebel sought to exterminate Yahwistic prophets. Now, this may not sound incredibly weird in modern times, this idea of eliminating false gods or wanting people of a certain nation to worship one god, but it would have been quite out of the ordinary for the ancient world. The ancient world tended to have a base level of pluralism. You could worship whatever gods you wanted as long as you recognized the chief gods, and to try to eliminate the worship of one god may have brought divine wrath on you from that god. So, it wasn't typically attempted, which makes Jezebel's campaign against the Yahwistic prophets like Elijah a bit of an anomaly.
Jezebel's death is a somewhat bizarre episode that's fairly well detailed in the biblical record. Now, there are multiple reasons for this, perhaps the most notable being that Elijah is said to have prophesied about it. He said that the dogs of Jezreel would eat her flesh and that nothing would be left to be able to recognize her. It's a pretty gruesome affair. 2 Kings 9 details the circumstances of her death. Jehu was an Israelite military commander whom the prophet Elisha had anointed in secret and telling him that he would bring an end to the Omrides. And we find that story in 2 Kings, where we're told, "When Jehu came to Jezreel, Jezebel heard of it, and she painted her eyes and adorned her head and looked out of the window. And as Jehu entered the gate, she said, 'Is it peace, you Zimri, murderer of your master?' And he lifted up his face to the window and said, 'Who is on my side? Who?' 2 or 3 eunuchs looked down at him. He said, 'Throw her down.' So they threw her down, and some of her blood spattered on the wall and on the horses, and they trampled on her." That's that, right? Rough way to go, but very matter of fact. Well, perhaps unsurprisingly, these verses have a number of different proposed interpretations, as well as some interesting parallels in the ancient world. First, we know Jezebel is a politically savvy woman. She knows Jehu is staging a coup and killing all of Jezebel's family, and she sees him coming. So she prepares to meet Jehu by painting her eyes, adorning her head, and looking out the window. Why does she do this? Why does she need to get all gussied up to die? This act of putting on makeup in the face of clear and present danger has earned Jezebel her reputation throughout the Western world, perhaps even more than her persecution of Yahwistic orthodoxy. She is seen as vain and worldly, and there are differing opinions as well as some interesting archaeological parallels for her actions. The painting of her eyes would have been done with something called kohl, a dark brown or black mixture of different compounds mixed with oil that were applied to the eyes to accentuate or exaggerate particular features. Fixing her hair may have included applying incense, coloring it, or affixing jewelry. All of these things are well attested in the ancient Near East, from kohl tubes with applicators to cosmetic palettes to incense burners and jewelry. There are all kinds of parallels for what she may have done to prepare herself. There are also dozens of ivory plaques from Assyria, Syria, and even Samaria, which date to between the 9th and 8th centuries and feature the so-called woman in the window motif. This motif has a frontally facing woman, often with clearly defined eyes and an Egyptian-presenting hairstyle. The head is often over what appear to be a kind of balcony or balustrades and surrounded by successive walls or windows. This motif has been interpreted as presenting elite women within a palace or otherwise cloistered environment. Now, women in windows is an oddly specific motif, but one that we see frequently enough in the Bible and which has been interpreted in a variety of ways. It was clearly a popular motif in elite circles in the 9th and 8th centuries in Phoenicia, Syria, and areas within their cultural influence like Samaria. This positive motif in Phoenicia may have taken on negative connotations in Israel and Judah, where Jezebel in the window may be an allusion to this kind of image. We see the prophets being openly critical of the Israelite elites and their penchant for ivory. All that to say, there may be an interesting interplay between these artifacts of what was presumably a well-known motif among the elites of Phoenicia and Syria, and the biblical text which places a Phoenician queen in a window of a palatial building just before she meets her gruesome death. But back to the question of why does she behave the way she does? There's one understanding that Jezebel is attempting to seduce Jehu. Her appearance in the window has been interpreted as an invitation to Jehu to take her as his queen as a sort of Hieros Gamos motif. As the new king, Jehu could take the prior king's wives. I think of Absalom's rebellion where he takes David's concubines. This casts Jezebel's behavior as almost entirely self-serving. She's seeking to preserve her life and act to legitimize the man who slaughtered her family. Alternatively, she has been seen as facing death with dignity. She did not sulk and hide, but faced her end with courage and bravado, even by taunting Jehu when he came. Her allusion to Zimri, who was subject to a coup by the Omrides, would certainly not be lost on Jehu. She also may have been acting in an official capacity and was adorning herself for something like an official courtly reception. We know Jehu is coming to kill her and all her children, but she is committed to her duty as the queen and queen mother and behaves appropriately for that station until the bitter end.
Jezebel has a complicated legacy. From the way she's portrayed in the biblical narrative, she was not a good person, and she deserves all the bad press that she gets. Even in the New Testament, in the book of Revelation, Jezebel is used as a euphemism for a terrible woman. Now, this certainly means that by the 1st century, Jezebel had negative associations within Jewish and Christian circles. The Bible portrays her as unequivocally evil. But we should also note that the story of Jezebel comes to us from a Judahite perspective, not an Israelite one. Furthermore, in the period after the exile, there was a heightened sense of purity and exclusion around non-Jews within the returning community. Within this context, the foreign wife of a northern king who worshipped a foreign god is certainly going to get a bad reputation. Foreign gods, foreign wives, and foreign political entanglements were understood as major reasons why Judah was sent into exile. For Jezebel, that's 3 strikes, and the reforms of Ezra and Nehemiah sought to remove all of these foreign influences in the newly constructed Jewish community. But even though we don't know Jezebel outside the Bible, when we look at the historical context, we can also see that Jezebel was doing what was expected of her. She was acting like a 9th century ancient Near Eastern queen and queen mother, preserving family, political, and religious ties for the benefit of herself and her lineage. Now, this in no way excuses her bad behavior, but we should understand that she had a lot more agency than other women of her day. She had a role to play, and she was expected to play it, and she did. She was good at her job, and later generations understood that she was good at her job. It's just that later generations also understood that her job was antithetical to the purposes of the God of Israel. Thanks for joining us for this Beneath the Bible video. If you liked what you saw, be sure to give this video a thumbs up and check out our video on the role of the Queen Mother in the ancient Near East. We'd also love for you to share this video with a friend. And until next time, keep digging.